The last thing the planet HFY ever sent into space was a distress signal. It lasted 9 seconds. Then nothing. Grand Warlord Sareth reviewed the recording the way someone reviews a grocery list quickly, without feeling, and only to confirm nothing was missing. He set the audio file aside and looked at the next document on his screen. Planet designation, Sol III. Local name, Earth. Dominant species, human. The file was thin, embarrassingly thin by Droon standards. The Droon were not a species that celebrated. Celebration implied uncertainty, and uncertainty implied the possibility of failure. They had not failed in 164 attempts. Failure was, at this point, a theoretical concept, like a color they had never seen and did not expect to. Sareth was 412 years old. He had personally commanded 89 conquests. His body was the color of old slate, his 3 arms folded in the resting position of someone who had not been surprised in decades. He read the Earth file in 11 minutes. Military technology, chemically propelled projectiles, low-yield directed energy weapons, no orbital combat capability worth noting. Population, roughly 8 billion, spread across 7 continents, organized into nearly 200 separate governments that disagreed with each other about almost everything. No unified planetary defense. No experience fighting an alien species. No idea the Droon existed until approximately 3 weeks ago, when their long-range sensors would have picked up the fleet. Sareth handed the file to Intelligence Officer Drav and said, "Standard protocol. Broadcast the surrender document on arrival. Give them 72 hours." He said it the way someone says, "Pass the salt." Drav was younger than Sareth by 2 centuries, which in Droon terms made him practically an intern. He had 3 eyes like all Droon, but he used them differently than most. He was always looking at something slightly off to the side of what everyone else was watching. He took the file. He read it. He read it again. "Their population is 8 billion, he said. "Yes," said Sareth. "Across 200 governments." "Yes." "Who disagree with each other." "Correct." Drav paused, "and they still function as a civilization." Sareth looked at him. "They have for several thousand years, apparently. It is an unusual arrangement. It will not matter." He turned back to his screen. "Prepare the fleet for orbital insertion. We arrive at their dawn." Drav filed the Earth folder under Active Standard. He almost closed it. Then he stopped, opened it again, and added a personal note that he told no one about. Query: species maintains civilization despite radical internal fragmentation. Mechanism unclear. Flag for observation. He closed the folder. The fleet moved. On Earth, the Droon signal arrived at 04:17 on a Tuesday morning, Greenwich Mean Time. It broadcast simultaneously on every frequency the human communications network used: radio, microwave, digital, analog. Every television, every radio, every phone. The message had been pre-translated by Droon linguistic algorithms that had processed all human broadcast data collected over the previous 3 weeks. It said, "This world is now the property of the Droon hegemony. Resistance is cataloged and will not alter the outcome. Formal transfer of governance begins in 72 hours. Compliance is recommended." It repeated every 4 minutes. In Brussels, a woman named Anya Reyes was awake when the signal came in. She was always awake at that hour. She had a habit of reading old tactical documents at 4 a.m. because she couldn't sleep, and because reading bad strategy made her feel useful, even when no one was asking for her opinion. She was a lieutenant colonel with 17 years of service and a desk job that had nothing to do with 17 years of service. She heard the broadcast through her open window. She went to her computer. She read the translation. She sat very still for about 30 seconds. Then she opened a document she had written 6 years ago, a 200-page theoretical paper called Asymmetric Resistance Against a Technologically Superior Occupying Force. Her commanding officer at the time had called it academically interesting. He had said it with the exact tone people use when they mean completely useless. She read the first page, then she started making calls. In the European Space Agency's monitoring station outside Munich, Dr. Peter Havely had been awake for 31 hours straight. She had spotted the drone fleet 11 days ago on deep-range sensors. She had reported it immediately. She had been asked to re-verify. She had re-verified. She had been asked to re-verify again. By the time anyone believed her, the fleet was past Jupiter. Peter was a xenobiologist. She had spent 15 years building a first contact protocol that no one wanted. She had given lectures about it. She had published papers. She had been invited to conferences where people nodded at her seriously and then did nothing. Now every screen in the building was showing the drone broadcast, and people were running in hallways and shouting into phones. And Peter was sitting very quietly at her desk with a cup of tea that had gone cold, reading the surrender document for the 4th time. She noticed something small. The document's phrasing was almost identical to a fragment of drone broadcast data she had collected 3 weeks ago, a signal that had seemed like background noise at the time. Same sentence structure, same word order, same rhythm. She wrote in her notebook, template. They use a template. They don't write a new message for each world. They use the same one. She underlined it. She didn't know yet why it mattered. She would. Outside, the sky above Munich was beginning to lighten. And very far above that light, in perfect orbital formation, the drone fleet held its position and waited for humanity to do what every other species had done. They were going to be waiting a long time. The United Nations had never moved fast. It was built for argument, not speed, and it was very good at argument. But 41 hours after the drone broadcast, every delegate stopped arguing and started listening, because a woman no one had heard of 30 hours ago walked in, put a single printed page on the table and said, "Give me 20 minutes. After that you can go back to fighting." Her name was Anya Reyes, a lieutenant colonel on loan from NATO, awake for 2 days. She did not look like someone who had been awake for 2 days. She looked like someone who had been waiting their whole career for a problem this specific. The page had 7 bullet points. She talked through all 7 without notes. By the 3rd, the room was silent. By the 5th, the delegate from the largest nation on Earth was writing things down. By the 7th, the chair asked her to start over. Her argument was simple. You cannot beat a superior force by matching it. You beat it by making every step cost more than planned. They came expecting a transaction, she said. A quick one. Our job is to make it the most expensive transaction they have ever attempted. The UN issued its formal response 31 hours later, professionally worded, politely firm. The final word was no. The drone administrator sent to receive the surrender was named Orvith. He was a bureaucrat, not a soldier, because in 164 conquests, a soldier had never been needed at this stage. You sent the paperwork, people. Orvith landed in Geneva. He walked into the building expecting signatures. Instead, he found Anya Reyes, 3 translators, Dr. Peter Havely with a tablet of notes, and a very large, very quiet man named General Adami sitting in the corner like furniture with opinions. Orvith informed them this was not a negotiation. Anya said she understood and asked for a negotiation window. He said again, not a negotiation. She said completely understood and asked what the hegemony's timeline flexibility looked like regarding the transition period, which was technically a different question. Orvith opened his mouth, closed it. His translation algorithm flagged 3 words it hadn't encountered in that combination before. This continued for 40 minutes. Orvith, who had never been in a room this long with a species that hadn't surrendered yet, made a decision he would later describe in his report as an attempt to conclude the interaction. He granted a 30-day window before military action would begin. He reported it to Sareth as a minor procedural delay. Sareth accepted this without concern. 30 days was nothing. Drav read the Geneva transcript and added 4 paragraphs to his private observation file. The longest was about what he began calling the redirect technique, how Anya had held a non-compliant conversation for 40 minutes against a formally closed position, without raising her voice or making a single threat. No species in his records had done anything like it. Most, when told a position was non-negotiable, accepted it or panicked. She had done neither. She had kept talking, and the outcome had been different from what it was supposed to be. He filed it. He did not tell Sareth. The 30 days began. What happened inside those 30 days was not one dramatic thing. It was 10,000 small things, happening simultaneously, mostly invisible from orbit. Engineers worked in rotating shifts trying to crack drone shielding frequencies. They didn't succeed, but they built something that might be annoying. In South America, disaster relief tunnels became supply depots, food, medicine, water. Fishing fleets in the Pacific quietly repositioned. Nobody announced why. A 16-year-old in Bangalore posted a 40-minute video online, analyzing drone fleet positioning using only public sensor data. Within 18 hours, it had been viewed by 11 million people and forwarded to 4 defense ministries. The teenager was contacted, asked questions, and answered them. This would matter later. PETA had by now translated enough drone fragments to build a rough behavioral profile. She kept returning to the same point. The surrender document sent to Earth was nearly identical, word for word, to fragments she had collected weeks earlier and to partial records of transmissions sent to other worlds. Same structure, same rhythm, same document sent 164 times. They were not speaking to humanity, they were processing it. She called Anya. They've never had to think about us. Every move they make comes from a system that worked 164 times. That system is also the weakness. Anya said, "How do we break it?" PETA looked at her notes. "We don't break it. We refuse to fit inside it. Every time they run the calculation, the answer should come out wrong, different from every other species. Enough times and the system stops knowing what to do." There was a long pause. "That's going to hurt," Anya said. "Yes," PETA said quietly, "it is." Outside, the clock moved toward 0. The fleet held above the clouds, patient, certain, running the same numbers it had always run. Below, in basements and fishing boats and mountain tunnels and converted warehouses, people who had never fought an alien species got ready to be the first ones who did. Nobody was ready. That had never stopped humans before. Nobody on the drone flagship had ever seen a star system fight back quite like this. When the 30 days expired and no surrender came, Grand Warlord Sareth authorized Phase 1 without emotion, targeted infrastructure neutralization. The drone did not begin with destruction for its own sake. Destruction was wasteful. They wanted the planet intact for resource extraction, so they went surgical. Power grids, communication towers, transport bridges. Clean, precise, minimal. It worked on about 40% of their targets. The other 60% were empty. Drav was the one who figured it out first, 4 hours into Phase 1, when the damage reports came back half as large as projected. He pulled the pre-war satellite imagery and compared it to current scans. The comparison was strange. Many of the structures they had just hit showed signs of deliberate preemptive shutdown. Cables removed, systems drained. One relay tower had been structurally hollowed out and filled with non-functional material that looked real on the drone's orbital scanners, but was, essentially, a sculpture. A decoy. He flagged it. Sareth reviewed it and said the real infrastructure would be found. He authorized Phase 2, wider strikes. Phase 2 hit more decoys, and 3 of the Phase 2 strikes hit targets that had been wired. The moment the drone energy beam touched the structure, something inside it released a focused electromagnetic pulse from the ground up, at a frequency that drone shielding absorbed poorly. 3 orbital strike platforms flickered. One went dark for 11 minutes. It came back online, but it came back slower. Sareth noted the EMP anomaly. He told his engineering team to adjust shielding modulation. That adjustment would take 6 hours. In 6 hours, 17 more small things happened on the ground below, none of them significant on their own, all of them eating time. In an underground operations room somewhere in the mountains, the exact location was deliberately kept vague, even in internal documents. Anya Reyes stood at a table covered in maps and watched the reports come in. She was not celebrating. She was counting how many of her decoys had held, how many real targets had been exposed, how many hours each small action had purchased. General Adami stood beside her. He had a way of being in a room that made the room feel like it had a floor. She had started to rely on that. Phase 2 used 30% more energy than Phase 1, she said, reading from the sensor data. They're burning through fuel faster than they planned. How much faster? We don't know their reserve capacity, but faster is faster. The strategy she had built, the one from the paper nobody had read, was based on a simple idea: friction. Not the friction of matching force against force, but the friction of sand in a machine. Individually, each grain of sand is nothing. Together, over enough time, they wear the gears down. Her cells were already operating. Not armies' cells, 12 people, 20 people, 50 at most. Each one self-sufficient, each one with enough authority to act without asking permission, connected not by a chain of command the drone could find and cut, but by protocol. Shared plans, shared logic. A network of people who knew what to do when they couldn't reach anyone. A maintenance worker who had been employed at a drone-occupied refinery for 3 weeks learned how their filtration systems worked. She broke it in a way that took 12 days to diagnose. A group of former urban search and rescue volunteers in one major coastal city knew every underground passage, every maintenance shaft, every forgotten crawl space. The drone ground survey teams had high-resolution maps of the city's streets and buildings. They had nothing for what was underneath. A retired deep-sea fisherman in the northern Atlantic knew the current patterns along a 600-kilometer stretch of ocean so well he could navigate it blind. The drone's positioning algorithms, calibrated for their home world's ocean models, did not know what he knew. The boats he guided moved through those waters undetected. Drav submitted his second report to Sareth. It was longer than the first. It noted that resistance was not following the standard post-strike decline curve. In the drone's database of 164 conflicts, organized resistance after Phase 1 and Phase 2 strikes typically fell by 60 to 70% within the first 8 days. It was now day 11. Resistance had increased. Sareth read the report. He told Drav that early-stage resistance patterns varied and that the model would stabilize. He was not wrong that the model usually stabilized. He was reasoning from 164 examples, which was a reasonable thing to do. The problem was that all 164 examples were from species that, at some biological or cultural level, made a calculation about survival and found that surrender was the answer. Peter Havley, who had not slept properly in 3 weeks and was now essentially living in the operations room, had a theory about why humans weren't making that calculation. She had been building it from fragments of alien psychology. She had read over 15 years of preparation for a day she always believed would come. She wrote it in her notebook. In the quiet hour before dawn, other species evolved to survive. Humans evolved to survive and to remember who died. The second part changes the math. She hadn't told Anya yet. She was still working out what it meant operationally. Outside, Sareth looked at Earth through the viewport of his flagship. It was a small world, blue and white, very calm from up here. He had looked at 164 worlds. They all looked calm from up here. He authorized Phase 3. He had never needed Phase 3 before Day 14. The Droon had conquered desert worlds, ice worlds, high-gravity worlds with air so thick you could almost chew it. They had fought on floating continent platforms and inside cave systems that went 30 kilometers deep. They had never, in 164 campaigns, lost a single soldier to Mud. On Earth by Day 19, Mud had immobilized 11 Droon ground vehicles. Not destroyed, immobilized, stuck. The engineering team that was sent to recover the first vehicle sank their recovery platform into the same patch of ground and had to be rescued by a third team who got one wheel stuck themselves. Drav read the field report with the particular attention of someone watching a pattern emerge. The Droon home world had low rainfall, thin topsoil, and almost no standing water outside of polar zones. Droon ground vehicles were built for hard surfaces. Earth had not read that specification. Earth had rivers, swamps, rice paddies, beaches, rainforests, and about 11 different kinds of terrain that existed nowhere in the Droon's collective military experience. It was not just mud. The tropical zones were the worst. Droon thermal scanners were calibrated to read heat signatures against the backdrop of their home world's temperature baseline. In an equatorial rainforest, where the air itself was warm and wet and full of living things generating heat, the scanners produced a visual field that looked like someone had sneezed on the screen. A squad of resistance fighters could stand 12 meters away from a Droon patrol and be invisible to every scanner the patrol carried, as long as they didn't move. They learned not to move. A Droon commander named Voss, decorated, methodical, widely considered one of the best field officers in the hegemony, filed his report on Day 23 from a fortified position outside what had once been a coastal city. The report was honest. Voss was one of those soldiers who considered honesty a professional duty even when it was personally uncomfortable. He noted, urban environments were non-standard. The Droon tactical model assumed a ground campaign would involve open field engagement or the clearance of fortified positions. Earth cities were neither. They were networks, layered, three-dimensional, full of passages that did not appear on any surface map. The defenders knew those networks. The Droon did not. Every street that looked clear had 3 possible ambush points that couldn't be confirmed without entering them. Entering them, as 2 of his units had learned, was frequently a mistake. He also noted, in a paragraph he marked as secondary but that Drav would later consider the most important thing anyone wrote during the war, the defenders had no single point of command. In every previous campaign, when the Droon identified and neutralized the military command structure of a species, resistance collapsed within 8 to 12 days. There was no command structure to find here. There were hundreds of small ones. Destroy 1 and 2, more were already acting independently nearby. This is not a military, Voss wrote. This is a behavior. You cannot bomb a behavior. Voss also flagged a supply concern. The Droon fleet had arrived provisioned for a 14-day conquest. It was now Day 23. The resupply chain from the nearest hegemony logistics depot, 2 light weeks away, was being harassed by what the crew had started calling the swarm, hundreds of small human spacecraft, none of them military grade, none of them individually threatening, all of them constantly present around the logistics approach corridors. They weren't trying to destroy resupply ships. They were trying to slow them. They were succeeding. In the operations room, Peeta Havili had finally slept 8 hours in a row for the first time in 3 weeks. She woke up and immediately told Anya the theory she had been building. She explained it carefully. Most species, when facing extinction-level threat, calculate that survival means compliance. Their evolutionary programming pushes toward it. Surrender equals living. Living equals passing on your genes. The math is clean. Humans had the same programming. But somewhere in 10,000 years of recorded history, humans had also built something on top of it, a cultural layer that in some circumstances could override the base calculation. Stories, memory, the names of the dead, monuments, holidays. Humans were the only species PETA knew of that built structures specifically to remember their losses, not just to honor victories, to remember the people they had failed to save. That changes the calculation, PETA said. Dying in resistance is not just death. It means something to the ones who survive. It gets remembered. Humans are willing to die for what gets remembered. Anya was quiet for a moment. You're saying they can't break our morale the way they broke everyone else's. I'm saying every strike they make that kills people doesn't weaken resistance. It strengthens it. The dead become the reason to keep going. PETA paused. They are operating a machine designed to produce surrender. Every input they add is producing the opposite output. Anya walked to the map on the wall. She stood there for a long time. Then she said something quietly, not quite to PETA and not quite to herself. Then we have to make sure they keep making inputs. Day 28. Voss filed a second report requesting resupply acceleration and permission to escalate bombardment to clear resistance corridors. Sareth granted the escalation. Resupply moved slower than requested. And Drav, reading Voss's reports and PETA's intercepted transmissions, and the incoming damage assessments, wrote 4 words at the bottom of his observation file and stared at them for a very long time before deciding not to delete them. We have made a mistake. Drav had never transmitted a report over Sareth's head before. In the Droon military, doing so was career-ending at best, and in some historical cases, literally ending at worst. He thought about it for 6 hours. He thought about the 4 words he had written in his file. He thought about Voss's reports. He thought about the swarm that was now adding an average of 4 extra days to every resupply cycle. Then he transmitted 4 unedited reports, in full, directly to the Droon High Council. Sareth had been summarizing the reports before sending them upward. Not lying, summarizing. Selecting the parts that fit the expected narrative. The Droon High Council, 4 light-years away, had been receiving the impression that Earth was progressing as normal, if slightly behind schedule. When the unedited versions arrived, the High Council convened within 9 hours. The session lasted 3 days. At the end of it, they did something they had not done in the hegemony's entire military history. They contacted Drav directly, bypassing the Grand Warlord's chain of command, and asked him to present his full findings. Drav presented them, all of it, the mud, the thermal scanner failure in warm environments, the decentralized resistance structure with no head to cut off, Voss's report about behaviors, PETA's intercepted note about memory and the dead, the supply shortfall numbers, the EMP anomaly, the swarm, the cost curves. The High Council's lead strategist asked a single question when Drav finished. What is your projection for the standard capitulation timeline? Drav said, I do not have one. I cannot produce a projection for a species whose response pattern does not match any existing model. That answer, delivered in flat Droon professional language, was the most alarming thing the High Council had heard in 200 years. On day 41, Grand Warlord Sareth made the worst decision of his 400-year career. He had received word that his command was under review. He understood what that meant. In a Droon military career, a command review at this stage of a campaign meant that someone was preparing to relieve you. He had perhaps 10 to 15 days before the council's order arrived. He decided to act before it did. He authorized orbital strikes on 3 population centers simultaneously. Not infrastructure, population. The logic was the logic he had seen work in the later stages of long holdouts before. Overwhelming shock to the civilian body accelerates the collapse of the military resistance ideology. Force the fighters to choose between continuing and watching everything they are fighting for be destroyed. The strikes hit. The casualties were catastrophic. The numbers when they came in were unlike anything Earth had seen in a generation. In the operations room, Anya received the report. She read it without expression. She sat with it for a moment. Then she said very quietly, "They just made the war unwinnable for themselves." General Adami looked at her. "Explain." "Until right now, there were people in this network, good people, sensible people who were quietly calculating whether surrender might be the better choice. Fewer deaths, longer suffering maybe, but immediate survival." She set the report down. "They just destroyed that argument. Surrender doesn't save lives now. Everyone can see that. Every person who was on the fence just fell off it on our side." She stood up. "And they've killed their own soldiers. 3 occupied urban zones gone. They've just demonstrated to every human on Earth that the Droon are not in control of this. You don't bomb your own positions unless you're scared." The response on the ground confirmed it. Resistance networks that had been at 60% capacity surged. Enlistment in underground cells tripled in 4 days. A neutral nation that had been quietly attempting to negotiate a separate arrangement with the Droon, hoping to sit the war out, abandoned those negotiations after watching the broadcast of the strikes. Their government issued a public statement at 2 a.m. local time. It contained one sentence: "We are with Earth." On the flagship, Sareth received the High Council's order to stand down. He was replaced by a commander named Verak. She was younger, quieter, and had a reputation not as a conqueror but as a strategist, which in the Droon military was a different category of person entirely. Verak arrived with orders that had never been written for a Droon campaign before. Assess whether a negotiated withdrawal was possible. Drav watched her read his complete file, all 47 pages of it, without speaking. When she finished, she asked him only one question: "Is there a version of this where we win?" Drav considered it. He was an intelligence officer. His job was accuracy. Not within any acceptable cost threshold, not anymore. Verak nodded slowly. She was quiet for a moment. "Then we need a door." PETA heavily intercepted the command transfer communications 6 hours after Verak's arrival. The translation was partial, about 60% readable, but enough. She came to Anya immediately. Anya read the partial translation twice. She stood still for a long time. "They're looking for a way out," PETA said. "I know." Anya set the paper down. "The question is whether we let them find one and what we ask for at the door." It was the most important strategic question of the entire war, and it had nothing to do with weapons or soldiers. It was a question about what kind of species humanity wanted to be when this was over. Anya knew that wars could be survived. She also knew that what you chose to do at the end of one followed you for a very long time afterward. She picked up a pen. She started writing. The station had no name. It had been a cargo relay platform before the invasion, and now it was the location of the only negotiation in Droon history where the hegemony was the party seeking terms. Verak arrived with 3 advisors. Drav was one of them, which meant the person who had spent the entire war writing careful notes about humanity was now sitting across a table from the people he had been writing about. He noted this was interesting. He wrote it down. Anya Reyes led the human delegation. General Adami sat to her left. PETA heavily sat at the far end of the table with a notebook and 3 pens. The first meeting lasted 11 hours and produced cleared ground but no movement. Verak opened with terms that were still in structure: a form of partial control, reduced Droon administration, monitored independence, resource agreements in hegemony favor. Anya declined each component individually, clearly without anger, offering alternative language every time. Drav recognized the technique. He had named it months ago. He did not point this out. On day 2, something shifted. During a recess, Drav stood at the observation window looking at Earth below. PETA walked over and stood beside him. Neither spoke for a moment. Then Drav said, in careful English he had been practicing for weeks, "Your world is very much water." 71%, PETA said. "Ours is 9, a pause. "We have always found that strange, the water." "Do you have oceans?" We did long ago, they are gone now. Another pause, we used them. He said it simply, and there was something in the way he said it, not pride and not quite regret, but something between the two, a weight that did not have a droon word. Peeta wrote in her notebook when she returned to the table, "They have lost things they can't mourn properly. That matters." By day 5 the framework took shape. Full droon withdrawal within 60 days, return of all seized assets, a reparations process to follow, Earth designated as sovereign protected space, a legal status that did not exist in droon law until Verak's team drafted it on the spot, a permanent diplomatic channel. Each term took time. The resource rights clause consumed all of day 4. It ended with both delegations eating in exhausted silence before the final language was agreed. It was the first shared meal between droon and humans. Drav ate what was offered with careful attention. He noted that human bread was surprisingly good. He did not say this out loud. On the final day, Anya proposed the last term. She had kept it deliberately. She asked for the full records of all 164 conquered worlds. Everything, names, populations, locations, current status, what had happened, where the survivors were. The room went very quiet. Verak looked at the document a long time. The records were not a secret. The droon had simply never been asked for them. No species had survived long enough to ask. She signed it. The Sol Accords were finalized at 14:32 station time. The droon filed them internally as Case 165, the first in the hegemony's history with the outcome, Withdrawal Treaty. The fleet departed over the following weeks. The last ship passed the outer solar system on a quiet morning in early spring, briefly visible on a southern hemisphere array, then gone into the noise of deep space. Anya watched the final sensor reading from the operations room. When the signal faded, she sat down. General Adami sat beside her. After a few minutes he said, "What happens now?" "We rebuild," she said, "which will take longer than the war and be argued about more." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "You sound tired." "5 months tired," she stood. "I'm going home." She called Dario from the operations room. The call lasted a long time. She didn't tell him much. She didn't have the words for most of it yet. She told him she was coming home. He said he'd been watching the news. There was a silence between them different from the old ones. This one had room to breathe. Drav's final report was submitted 6 weeks after the withdrawal, 847 pages. The last line read, "Recommendation, consider whether there is a better way to meet a new civilization than with a weapon. We have encountered, for the first time, a species from whom there is something to learn. I suggest we begin." 2 High Council members requested Drav be assigned to the new diplomatic channel permanently. He accepted. 6 months after the last droon ship left, Peeta sat across a table from Drav in the newly opened Earth diplomatic office. She had a stack of questions she'd been collecting for 20 years. Drav looked at the stack. "You have prepared thoroughly." "I have been waiting for this conversation my entire adult life," Peeta said. He considered that, as have I, though I did not know it until recently. They sat down. Outside, the sky was clear. The stars felt, for the first time, like an address rather than a question, and somewhere in the data now stored on Earth servers were 164 worlds, waiting to find out they had not been forgotten.